Okay, hello everyone and welcome and thank you very much for joining us on this sunny but cold day when it's very difficult for us to get our minds of the sad developments that are happening in our northern front. So this is the first meeting webinar that we have organized as a newly established Ontological Security Studies Research Group in Turkey. And we are very delighted to have Professor Catarina Kinnvall from Lund University in Sweden as our inaugural speaker. So first, I would like to say a few words about this ontological security theory research group. We are basically, we're informal network, of scholars, students researching on this theme in Turkey. And previously we have met as, a much smaller group to do some joint reading and discussion. And we have decided to also organize a series of talks of the kind that we're going to have today in order to build a research community, broader research community in Turkey. So I'll start first by briefly introducing myself, then I'll pass the floor to my other colleagues who were involved in this organization. My name is Bahar Rumelili, and I'm based at Koç University in Istanbul. And for the past 8 years or so, I have been working on ontological security theory, first in the context of the study of conflict resolution. And recently, I'm interested in building on its emotional component in the form of study of anxiety and its impact on international politics. So I may now maybe give the floor to Helin Sarı Ertem to briefly introduce herself.
Hi, this is Helin Sarı Ertem, Associate Professor from Istanbul Medeniyet University of International Relations Department. Actually, when I was writing my PhD thesis on American foreign policy in terms of identity and security relationship, I got this concept. I came across with this concept of ontological security, and it really had a great impact on my PhD thesis, which was written 11 years ago. So I also think that this area is quite rich, and we should introduce it more to our students, our colleagues in Turkey. So hopefully Catarina's speech will make a kind of kick to this initiative. We are trying to be a group of ontological security studying group in Turkey. And yeah, we'll start with Catarina, and hopefully we continue with other professors in the area. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Helin.
You're welcome.
Now I'd like to give the word to Umutcan to introduce himself very briefly, please.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Umutcan Adısönmez. I'm a lecturer at İzmir University of Economics, and I focus on peace and conflict processes. Specifically, I study the interaction among trauma, memory, and international politics within the Middle Eastern context. And I was privileged to be supervised by Catarina during my master's at Lund, and she was the one who introduced ontological security. So I feel myself really privileged on this. So it's a special reunion for me today, and I'm super excited for today's discussion. So Erman, would you like to introduce next?
All right, sure. Thank you, Hocam. I'm delighted to be a part of this event, and I'm a PhD student at Kadir University's International Relations Department. I'm currently working on the EU-Turkey relations and its political psychological dimension. So back to you, Bahar Hocam.
And Aslı Nur, who's played a very important role in this organization. So certainly last but not least.
Thank you. Thank you hocam. It's Aslı Düzgün. I'm a PhD candidate at Istanbul University. I became interested in ontological security thanks to my dear supervisor, Helen Sarı-Ertem. She taught and advised me to study ontological security for the first time. And then I learned a lot about ontological security with the online classes with Professor Rumelili. And I was continuing to write my thesis with the great support of both my supervisor and Professor Rumelili. Then I came to Lund as a TÜBİTAK scholarship holder for a year, and now I'm working with Professor Kinnvall. And I have to say that I consider myself very lucky to work with her. She's an amazing, inspiring supervisor and a teacher. My title of thesis I'm working on is Repercussions of the United States Anxiety of Decline on its Israel policy. Sorry. In a word, I study the American foreign policy towards Israel from the lens of ontological security, and I believe that we can do good work together as scholars and students working on ontological security, and I warmly welcome you all to this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aslı. So without taking any longer time of introducing ourselves, I'd like to now introduce our very special guest, our inaugural speaker, and if I may say also the founding mother of ontological security studies in Europe. And she has definitely been the pioneer in introducing this notion to the study of globalization and IR, first with a 2004 article in Political Psychology. And subsequently, Catarina Kinnvall has developed ontological security theory into a framework to study migration, multiculturalism, the intersection of globalization and security. More recently, the study of populism and rise of nationalism, and also in the context of gender and post-colonialism. Empirically, her focus has been more on South Asia and Europe. Her work connects political psychology, especially psychoanalytical theory, with international relations theory in the context of these areas of interest. She's the author and editor of many books and journal articles. So I'll just mention the most recent ones. For example, a book she co-edited has come out of Routledge in 2019, titled Climate Hazards, Disasters, and Gender Ramification. Another co-edited book, Ontological Insecurity in the European Union, also published by Routledge in 2019. A co-edited book on bordering securities from Routledge in 2014. She's also the co-editor of the Palgrave Handbook of Global Political Psychology, and also the co-author of the Oxford University Press book, The Political Psychology of Globalization, Muslims in the West. And among her most recent articles, I just had the pleasure to read the article Exploring the Populist Mind. I really enjoyed reading that, Catarina, Anxiety, Fantasy, and Everyday Populism, co-authored with Ted Svensson and published in the British Journal of Politics and IR. And also another co-authored article, Populism, Ontological Insecurity, and Gendered Nationalism, Masculinity, Climate Denial, and COVID-19. Catarina has certainly also been very generously supporting Turkish academics, also in her previous role as the vice president of the International Society of Political Psychology, and through her supervision of scholars like Umut Can, Aslı Nur, and also through her many generous collaborations with me and others. So I'm very pleased and happy to be hosting her in this occasion. So Catarina, without taking more time, I'd like to give the word to you, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Bahar. That's very kind words of you. And thanks also, Aslı Nur, Umut, Helen, and Erman for organizing this webinar. And thanks to all of you for sending so many excellent questions to me. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer them all in detail, but I'm going to do my best after this short presentation. I don't have a PowerPoint, so you will just have to bear with me as I present. So I'm very happy to be here today, and it's lovely to see so many of you coming in at this time, at this horrible time, I have to say. It's difficult to think about anything else, and we're certainly ontologically insecure, I think, on average right now. So I think it's perhaps a good time to talk about ontological security and insecurity. So Bahar has asked me to talk about ontological security theory, main achievements and future directions. And I would try to give a kind of bit of a broad picture where we are today in theoretical, perhaps a little bit empirical terms, but related also, I guess, to my own work on the subject. So it's kind of a little bit of an overview, but also focused on some of the criticism, some of the debates that are going on right now in ontological security theory. So I want to proceed from some of the debates in the field, which I think many of us are struggling with right now. I mean, debates that have emerged from various criticisms to both the field, but also to the concept of ontological security per se. And one of the debates concern whether collective ontological security is a necessary or supportive condition for cohesion, and perhaps even for solidarity. And also by the extent also to which such cohesion can be fostered through kind of conflict and diversity. And this has been quite a prominent debate in ontological security literature, and it raises two questions, I think. I mean, firstly, is ontological security or the strive for security a universal need? I mean, this is something we need to think about, you know, what is behind this concept? And secondly, does a cohesive subject actually exist? And in that case, what does such a subject look like? And this is where we can see a number of debates in ontological security literature that I think we need to think about and respond to. So the concept as developed by Giddens, who takes his point of departure in Lang's psychoanalysis and Winnicott's symbolic interactionism, puts kind of trust in others as the most central component for experiencing a stable world on which to establish a coherent sense of self-identity, which in Giddens' terms then means a security of being, as you're all aware of. And that such security of being relies on, in Giddens' terminology, on predictability found in everyday life, in social routines that Jennifer Mitzen talks about, that structures everyday interactions as kind of natural and normal. So this focus on routines and stable identity seeking in the IR ontological security literature has been criticized. It's been criticized for applying both an individual and a Western lens to security thinking, and also been criticized for treating collective bodies like the nation or the state as homogeneous agents with emotions and psyches. And in addition, there has been criticism leveled at ontological security work for privileging continuity and status quo rather than opening up for disruption and change, which means that it entails, I mean, it's been criticized for entailing a conservative bias with little space for critical interventions. And me and Jennifer and Bahar and other people have been involved in some of this debate also, especially in the International Theory Forum. But what I want to talk about is how much of this criticism can be related to Giddens' privileging of agency over structure as the basis for the dualism at heart of his structuration theory. So instead of explaining how social structures are lived through the psyche through emotions and various cultural identifications, Giddens' conceptualization of ontological security relies on the unconscious being basically the reliance on the routines of daily life, in which the fundamental security system is largely socially unprocessed and without a history. And I think this is a fair criticism against Giddens, but it's also something that we continue to perhaps not think about always in the literature. So this criticism relates to the question of whether constructions and experiences of security or kind of protection act as specific ways to foster ontological security. So the role of protection as a way to provide ontological security can be viewed in theoretical terms to correspond with some of these critical responses to Giddens' emphasis on routines and the continuity bias. I mean that ontological security scholars favor some kind of status quo, which has been one of the main criticisms. And this is something that's been debated, and this is where I want to return to the literature, what we're doing right now, has been debated in the kind of phenomenological, existentialist ontological security literature. And it's been debated by going back to Lang in some sense, and his reliance on existentialist philosophers like Kierkegaard, Heidegger, and Tillich, for instance. So these ontological security works are then predominantly focused on the concept of anxiety and how anxiety is fundamental to subjecthood and agency. And in these writings, anxiety is often understood as a kind of lack of an identifiable object of fear, as being a constitutive condition of life. I mean, Bahar has talked a lot about that, and I know she's given a lot of presentations on anxiety also. And so anxiety in some sense both circumscribes and enables agency. It can enclose individuals into previous arrangements of power, what Behrens-Cotter terms creative, constitutive, or muted agency, or, and this is equally important, it can open up for alternative conceptualizations, what most scholars refer to as some kind of emancipatory agency. So considering that Lang drew significantly on the phenomenological existentialist tradition, it's no coincidence that the existentialist literature has proved a useful avenue for responding to some of the criticism. And most importantly, has been perhaps the ways in which anxiety and security have been approached to allow for both change and creativity in the anxious subject. And this is something I think is quite new to the ontological security literature. So by focusing on anxiety as an interpersonal phenomenon in which goals can be redefined, modified, and changed, as well as on the human capacity for creative activity, the existentialist literature has been a useful tool for addressing the continuity bias in ontological security literature that largely draws on Giddens' discussion of ontological insecure individuals that clings to the rigid, to the familiar at kind of any cost. However, and this brings me to the question of how we can perhaps observe or study ontological security or insecurity, which is perhaps a more important factor, thinking of why certain emotional forms of kind of togetherness occur and how we observe this in practice, which is something I will come back a little bit to later. So in order to discuss this, we need to think of what such feelings of togetherness actually imply in terms of cohesion, in terms of this strive for a cohesive self, as Giddens talked about, that can protect us from anxiety, fear, and unknown future. And here I think we again turn to a debate in the ontological security literature, where some scholars, and myself included, and Bahar alluded to this a little bit in her presentation, argue that both Lang and Giddens, as well as to some extent the existentialist ontological security literature, have remained uncertain about the radical decentering of the subject, as envisaged in much post-structural and psychoanalytical thought. That both Lang and Giddens end up claiming significant space for agency and autonomy of the individual subject. Lang, by criticizing the Freudian model of the subject, the ego, id, and superego, in favor of a model of what he calls integral selfhood and personal identity, and Giddens, by emphasizing individual reflexivity and broad assumptions that social agents are in command of some implicit knowledge, and self-understanding, regardless of their social and political context. And in both, I argue, and quite a few with me, that there is a limited incorporation of unconscious processes in this discussion of ontological security, with the consequence that multiple subjective identification are spelled out in much psychoanalysis in terms of unconscious fantasy, in terms of repressed desire, are largely ignored. So here, I and many with me have suggested a move away from Giddens' focus on ontological security as a security of being, related to Lang's belief in integral selfhood, something that individuals can possess or have, towards a focus on ontological security as a process that is constantly in progress, as a temporal process of always wanting to be while never quite getting there. So such a shift in focus implies that there is no core or autonomous self to return to in order to feel ontologically secure. So to unpack these ideas, a number of ontological security scholars have turned to Lacan, whose take on subjectivity begins with a notion of a kind of anti-foundational, non-reductionist, and socio-political conception of subjectivity expressed through images, fantasies, and desires. But scholars have also turned to more post-structural, post-colonial, gender analytical analysis to account for how cultural norms, patriarchy, social practices, and other forms of cultural and institutional power likely to circumscribe individual choices, and how those are not fully accounted for in either Giddens or Lang's notions of integrated selfhood or reflexive self. So to many post-structuralists and post-colonialists, this has been a focus on how these processes exercise a form of social control, what Lang talks about, the symbolic order in some sense. So from a psychoanalytical perspective, the focus has been on kind of the multiple and implicit ways of attachment and unconscious ties in which self and others are formed, but also on the attachment between self and identity, also addressing, the kind of another critique for conflating self and identity that has come from some of the critical scholars. So this is focused then on how identity becomes a fantasy attachment to this kind of subjective relationships. So how they are related to fantasy and subjective relationships. So the idea that individuals engage in multiple subjective identification as experience in unconscious fantasy is also challenging Giddens' conceptual opposition that formed the basis of much of his work, like active and passive, knowledge and desire, mind and body. So the reflexive capability of self thus remained overshadowed by other forces, various forces, including then the system of social relations, of desire, and of language. So it is a way of bringing in some sense, the critical notions that have been trying to address ontological security and see what happens to them when we try to look at other things. So in concrete terms, a focus on fantasies and fantasy narratives illuminates how the search for ontological security, although a very powerful story that continues to play crucial parts in the narratives that people, group, and states construct to make sense of themselves, is a story, a fantasy that can never be fulfilled. So in responding to increased feelings of ontological insecurity, people, groups, and state representatives temporarily close down categorical identifications. So it's a form of what we call banal representational fantasy that works to defend against emotional anxieties and traumatic experiences. So my suggestion for the field of ontological security theory would be to look at how these categorical identifications look in practice and what particular fantasies or fantasy narratives are presented to pin down a sense of togetherness, a sense of cohesion, a sense of wholeness. So this means asking a number of questions in relation to more empirical studies of ontological security. Empirical studies that are often focused on discourses or narrative studies on the relationship between self and identity, the relationship between self and other, the securitization of self and other. So one thing you have to ask is if the study of discourses or even narratives is enough to properly capture the emotional dimension of ontological security, the fantasy aspect. Do we need to also study the attachment to such discursive fantasies and why certain fantasies rather than others appeal to a populace or to various groups or to various states, while other narrative fantasies don't? And a lot of recent ontological security work on nationalism and populism, etc., have focused on these kind of questions. They're interested in these attachments, why do certain fantasies stick, in some, to use Sarah Ahmed's terminology, why do certain fantasies stick while others don't? And of course, that becomes particularly important perhaps when we talk about certain discourses like migration discourses, populist discourses, nationalist discourses, war discourses. What is it within these that emotionally affect and respond to kind of this kind of need for attachment? And more generally, I would say this has also consequences for how we study security-centered narratives as a whole. So just take, for example, studies of European integration, which is one of the things we've been focusing on in this book, and which was also a special issue. I mean, studies focused on the EU as a security union, studies focused on EU and strategic autonomy, European way of life, how European integration is being translated, shared, etc., among administrative actors in and around EU institutions. How we may need to ask then, how can we establish what such security-centered narratives look like? And how can we, and I think this is something we really have to think about, how can we go beyond self-representations of such security narratives in order to problematize their historical emergence in terms of imperialist fantasies, for instance? So again, how can we take in both the structural dimension and the more unconscious or psychoanalytical dimension? And how, in the case of European integration, for instance, can a focus on practices and issues related to things like identity, migration, populism, related to different ideas of Europe, how can that be captured without losing focus on pre-existing power structures? I mean, this is what Lacan talks about as the symbolic order that works on the unconscious rather than the conscious level. So I'm interested in thinking through, how can we both study this, but what is it that we actually study, when we try to capture this? So I think a theoretical focus on ontological security and IR theory, for me, is then a focus on, it's a focus on borders. It's a focus on bordering, on and de-bordering, but bordering both of, in some sense, of the body, the mind, the state, the nation, the collective in general. But it's also focused on mobilities, in a sense also mobilities and attachment. So it's a way to analyze, to me anyway, emerging kind of post-colonial and gendered spaces in which colonial imaginations of sovereignty and control continue to define inclusion and exclusion and the boundaries of states, societies, as well as the boundaries of body and mind. So it's as much the construction of the unconscious, to speak with Lacan, as it is an engagement with kind of predefined, inscribed categories to rely on somebody like Gayatri Spivak, a post-colonial author. So viewed like this, ontological security is focused on the everyday, the kind of banalness of identity performances in which self and others are formed, and in which routines, myths, and memories come to constitute these defining narratives. But it's not, in my mind, a reflexive self in Giddens' sense of the term, Rather, it is this kind of anti-essentialist, anti-foundational notion of believing kind of identity as origin, as if there was such a thing as kind of original identity that we can kind of come back to, as it's focused on examining the processes whereby we naturalize personal history, we naturalize desire into some kind of general truth. So as Stuart Hall has argued, I mean, if we think we have a unified identity, it's only because we're able to tell a convincing story of ourselves, about ourselves, so to speak. And what's interesting here is then also how this everyday is related to how ontological security plays out in conflict situation. And I think it's important to note here that in a world where a politics of fear, vulnerability, and insecurity is becoming increasingly related, the search for ontological security is perhaps not an exceptional process in kind of Agamben's terminology, but one that's increasingly related to how the everyday becomes reconstructed in relation to trauma, myth, and the governing of memory. So traumatic events, like, I mean, if we take 9/11, 7/7, Breivik massacre, we see in Ukraine right now, tend to, of course, disrupt continuity, tends to generate these powerful emotions, like a heightened sense of anxiety, dread of the unknown. But the response to such experiences are often to be found in the contestation of the past, present, and future as ways of closing down identity attachments. So it's not in that sense, I mean, this state is, of course, often exacerbated by society's initial emotional outburst in reaction to a traumatic event. I mean, there is this often a demand to return to normality, you know, which, speaking with Lacan, where the trauma becomes an encounter with the real, with a kind of unspeakable and unconscious. But, you know, but the whole idea of the normal, the whole idea of exception is something that we need to perhaps rethink in relation to the everyday. It's not something that we can cut off, you know, a starting point and end point, like a lot of trauma research does, but something that is more ongoing. And we need to understand those particular situations and what it is we appeal to in those particular situations, to understand why it is that certain memories, certain ideas, certain myths are able to be capitalized on. And of course, in this information we see right now on the media war, on misinformation, disinformation, on populist narratives, you know, this is even more important to see this as something perhaps not as an exceptional case, but as something that is going on continuously and takes certain forms. So finally, I mean, and this is my final sentence. So I think it is a focus in that sense of on the unspeakable a lot of times. It's a focus on the unconscious in relation to, you know, post-colonial, to racialized, to gendered spaces. And it's a focus on the silences as much as it is perhaps a focus on, you know, what is actually there. So it's a focus on, it opens up, I think, new empirical arenas for studying ontological security as a process related to the emotional governance of societies, but also to the emotional governance of kind of bodies and mind. And so for me, it's important to try to tie these together, which is also, I guess, a way to think how we can move from the individual level to the group level to the state level without committing some kind of psychological reductionism. So thank you. I think I end here.
Thank you very much for this brilliant exposition, I think, of the state of the field, highly original and also crystal clear. Thank you very much, Catarina.
Thank you.
During the registration phase for the webinar, we had asked the participants if they have any questions they would like to ask you. And from the list of questions we have received, as you know, I identified a number of them and forwarded them to you. So now I would like to give the opportunity to those students and scholars who've posed, interesting questions to directly address them to you. And I'm going to be starting with Hatice Demirci, who is an MA student at the Turkish National Defense University.
First of all, hello. I want to say welcome to our really small ontological security group. I want to ask a question about the concept of other in ontological security. And as you mentioned before, the globalization offers actors an environment in which uncertainties increase and therefore anxiety rises. Although the actors determine their own biographical narratives and actions through their other definitions, on the other hand, we can see that the global world order brings the relations too much more complicated. For example, China today is a country that the USA defines it as the other. And the other hand, we can see that they are really deep economic relations. In this context, I wonder that to what extent the actors of the global system can maintain their biographical narratives based on their perception of the other within the dependency network first upon them. Are biographical narratives based on the other definitions capable of creating collective identities within such a complex nexus of relationships? Thank you too much.
Thank you very much. I think that's an excellent question. I think one first has to address, what do we mean in some sense with biographical narratives? First of all, any biographical narratives, of course, always comes at the exclusion of other narratives and can rest on different levels of inclusion and exclusion in relation kind of to the nation, to borders, to memory. And of course, the more such biographical narratives are contested, the more difficult it is to keep them up in some sense, which is perhaps also part of explaining the kind of more illiberal tendencies in enforcing certain narratives in the light of kind of questioning and resistance. But I would also say that biographical narratives are not only built on relations to external others. I think Brent's work has shown quite a lot that in state terms, they're equally as related to redefined and kind of contested memories of self-conception. And of course, they're never just there, but they're continuously object of contention in some sense. So I think every time we think biographical narratives, we have this desire to close them down. And I think that's what we as ontological security scholars also have to think about, that we want to close it down as well, because it's much easier to study it if we close it down. But what we do then, it is we leave out, other ways of defining the biographical narratives and how those I think there is a question later on, how those biographical narratives can look very differently in different encounters. So there is, of course, a lot of, but every time you close it down, something is left out from the biographical narrative. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Catarina. So now, Ufuk Demir, please ask your question very briefly from, let me just check the name. Sorry, I don't know how I came up with that name. The next question is from Sibel Dündar and from Ufuk University. If you're in the room, please let us know. Okay, I guess not. So the next question I have is from Enes Arslan from Istanbul Medeniyet University. Are you here, Enes?
Yes, I am. Thank you firstly. I'm very new in the field, and as far as I see, most of articles focus on state level, but I wonder that how can we apply the theory to the non-state actors like terror groups or lone actors? Just that. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think we see in the literature, I mean, I could have said that, I guess, in the presentation, we see a division in the literature among those who focus more on the state level, on foreign policy, in the ontological security literature. And then we have perhaps those who focus more on the societal level, you know, so on everything from non-state armed actors to, you know, migratory group, to ethnic groups, to, you know, terror groups or, you know, lone actors. So I think there is quite a large society-centered literature that is more concerned with a, you know, below the kind of state level analysis. And I think most of my work has been focused on this and how we can understand how, and for me, it's a matter of how we can understand how any actor becomes preoccupied with the search for security by attaching themselves to particular identity constructions in which constructed memories, trauma, other emotional attachments play into the closing down of identity. So to me, I guess, regardless in some sense of what the focus is, I mean, whether the focus is on a collective actor, if it's on an individual, it's on, if it's on the state, it's about how these emotional attachments become a kind of integral part to any collective identity construction. And also to me, how this has always a kind of structural dimension. I mean, I said gender and racialized as well. So for instance, I mean, some of my work have been on Breivik, for instance, as a lone wolf actor. But to me, it's understanding Breivik as a lone actor is to understand how his ideas is submerged in ideas of whiteness, of Islamophobia, of Europeanness, and how such attachment fulfills fantasies of a larger collective body, you know, a kind of, in Breivik's case, you know, a body free from, not only free from Muslims in his case, or free from immigrants, but also free from feminists, from multiculturalists, from, you know, so to me, I see ontological security studies or theories as extremely relevant to understand any kind of non-state actor, as a collective body, and as a collective body that is in some sense emotionally constructed or constructed in relation to emotions. So thank you.
Okay, so next, Başar Baysal from Ankara Bilim University. Are you here, Başar?
Yes, Hocam, I'm here. Thank you very much for this opportunity and great presentation. My question is about the peace process and desecularization processes. There's a discussion about if the desecularization process requires an identity change from Huysmans and Aradov, and some other scholars reject this and argue that, like Paul Rowe, argue that this may cause ontological problems for the desecularized subjects, and they give the example of the minority groups in Balkans. How can we solve this problem, and maybe should we approach this desecularization from the perspective of identity change, or changing this, for example, deconstructing this identity of migrant and constructing new identities, or prioritizing the new identities like mother, father, worker? Or should we approach it like taking this identity, migrant or Muslim or other identities, securitized identities, from security realm to political realm, and not to regard them as security threats, but rivals or friends?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question, and I think it, first of all, I mean, you have that in your question itself. I mean, how should we think about desecuritization to start with? I mean, should we think of it in terms of the Copenhagen School as you know, removing a contentious subject from the agenda? If we think of it in those terms, I don't think that perhaps it's a necessary connection between desecuritization and the creation of ontological insecurity. But then we also think of it in a more, how should I say, a technical sense almost. So in that sense, I don't think it addresses the desecuritization that you talk about, I mean, in kind of conflict terms. And I think here we perhaps need to lift it. I mean, to desecuritize something means to challenge also closure. It means to challenge kind of, you know, autonomous or omnipotent notions of identity. And so it means to some extent make people aware, or making subjects aware of their incompleteness. I mean, then I think it's a matter of, you know, learning to live in the absence of kind of autonomous identity constructions. I mean, to be able to, some John Cash talks about dwell in ambivalence. I mean, for people to think that insecurity can also breed kind of creativity, you know, it doesn't have to be this kind of paralyzing state. But that I think means to address, you know, the larger identity narratives and what, you know, how those themselves rely on exclusionary politics. So I mean, I don't use the term desecuritization so much because I don't write on because I think it's also so closely tied to, in some sense, securitization theory. I mean, whether you talk about Copenhagen School or Bristol School or the Paris School. So I'm thinking it more of how can we stop thinking in terms of, you know, complete identities, because as soon as we do that, we start talking about inclusion and exclusion, and then we start talking about who is not included in that particular identity construction. So you know, so for me, it has to perhaps start at a more abstract level in some sense, but that's not really addressing your question about desecuritization, perhaps.
Thank you. Pınar Uz from Pamukkale University, are you here?
I think she is not here.
Okay. How about Güneş Uzunoğlu from Koç University? Oh, there she is. Okay.
You hear me, right? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Professor Kinnvall, for your insightful presentation. My question, I actually have two questions for you, and they both address the populism-ontological security relationship. And my first question asks whether you think this insecurity populism nexus is exclusive to far-right populism. I mean, I would like to ask you this populist generation of insecurity and security is specific, something is specific to far-right populism, or whether mainstream parties or other variants of populism can also adopt such security-centered narratives. And my second question is also, it is related with my first question. It asks basically how can we combat the populist narratives in general? I mean, how can the normal and mainstream politics can beat the populist narratives, and whether they are able to beat actually, and whether they are able to provide their alternative narratives over the populist narratives without requiring to adapting and imitating them. Yes, they are basically these two questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think in some sense you answer the question yourself. I don't think insecurity populism nexus is exclusive to far-right populism. I think as a process, you know, any attempt to find kind of, I mean, politics is always about, in some sense, about, you know, providing some kind of answers to problems, you know, and when we provide such answers, we also provide they also can act as security inducing mechanisms. I mean, we provide different kind of answers to, how, the question is, of course, that the further we go to the kind of far right populist, the perhaps, I mean, both more simplistic the answers become, I mean, in the sense of, what's the problem with migration? It's, certain immigrants, what's the problem with, so you have simple answers to complex questions, in order to kind of solve these insecurities. But you also, I mean, it's also where perhaps we see, the further more to the right you go, the more the problem that is to be solved is often found in the object of others, so we try to find, we point out particular object of others, migrants as responsible for economic crisis, so we point out particular object others to be able to solve these problems that then can appeal at the very kind of emotional level. Also, we use the language, so if we think about, migration language, where it's used, invasion, swarms of migrants, I mean, you use these kind of very visual and in some sense imaginative fantasies that kind of string an emotional chord. But that doesn't mean that other political parties don't use emotions and don't use an emotional language. But it's perhaps the messages themselves, as we go further towards the right, the object of contention becomes perhaps more defined and specified, and often forwarded as a response to a crisis. So the crisis is because of certain objects, So I think it's not exclusive far-right populism in terms of language itself, but in terms of specific others, in terms of specific objects of contention, the more we move to the right, the more defined those become to be the problem, so to speak. How can mainstream politics combat the populist narratives without adopting them? I mean, I think one of the things we see now is, of course, how in many societies, I mean, it may change now with the Ukraine crisis, but what we have seen is right parties in the center moving towards parties on the right. I mean, and in some sense, moving closer in terms of adopting their kind of crisis responses, and then moving closer in terms of their way of closing down identity and providing that kind of ontological security. So the question is, how can we stop this in some sense? How can we stop the move by more center parties towards more right-wing parties? And again, I guess we have a matter of, I mean, these perhaps needs to be addressed at the structural level as well. We need to address the kind of economic, social, political concerns and fears that perhaps lay as an, some kind of underlying concern for some citizens, but also, addressing this perhaps in terms of providing other narratives, so the populists are providing, kind of, what looks to be very homogeneous narratives that respond to these crises by pointing out certain people or certain groups or certain events as responsible. So we need to have, question those narratives, and also perhaps providing other narratives, providing narratives of hope, narratives of, so narratives that in some sense counter or challenge the narrative construction of populist far-right leaders. So, and I think that's something extremely important. I'm not sure.
And very difficult to manage, if I may add.
Of course, absolutely.
But definitely. So we have Nasuh Sofoğlu from Tayyip Erdoğan University. He has a methods-related question. There were also several others. So Nasuh, you can pose the question.
Thank you, Hocam. Thank you all so much for this privilege, and thank you, Professor Kinnvall, for sharing your latest insights on ontological security. My question is quite simple. There is no strict methodology to follow and analyze a case within the confines of ontological security. Do you consider this an advantage or a downside for the theory itself?
I mean, I would be very worried if there were strict methodologies. I guess that answers some of the questions. I think, one of the things I prefer ontological security studies than ontological security theory, because I think there are many different ways of approaching the concept of ontological security and insecurity. And I think what we have seen in the literature are many different ways of approaching these questions methodologically. I mean, we've seen, of course, discourse analysis, narrative analysis, interviews, document analysis, media analysis. And we have also seen, I would say, there was a recent article by a few Israeli scholars who used kind of quantitative methods and a more positivist kind of methodology. So, with how should I say, opportunities and constrictions that means, in a sense that if you want to measure it, you in some sense have to define down identity, or you have to define down it into discrete emotions or something. So there's also, you lose something out, of course, every time you depending on the methods you use. But I would say that that's probably one of the strengths of ontological security studies, is that, there are many different ways in which we can study this. I mean, we can use ethnographic analysis. I was just a discussant on one thesis that used kind of Lacanian discourse analysis, which I hadn't really seen before. And so I think to me, that's a strength. And I would say, though, that if there is anything that I think many people use and kind of, find quite useful, it is some kind of narrative analysis, I guess, because we are often focused on the stories, the stories people tell to make sense of themselves. I mean, that's kind of ontology per se. So I think in that sense, a narrative analysis perhaps is very, it's a very useful kind of analysis, but that doesn't mean that we can't use other different kind of ethnographic analysis or feminist methods, or I think there are many ways in which we can approach that. So I see it as a strength more than some kind of downside.
Thank you, Catarina. Well, as you know, we've received a large number of questions, and but some of them question posers are not in the room, and it's hard for me to determine who is in the room, who is not. So with my apologies, now I would like to just have an open floor Q&A session. I think that's much better. So even if you didn't pose a question during registration, you are now free to pose questions to Professor Kinnvall. Metehan Tatlı.
Thank you. Many thanks for the presentation. My question is related to identification process of the actors. Actually, as far as I know, there is a sort of harmony between actors' identity and actors' actions in order to be ontologically secure. My question is that which identity? How can actors choose the one identity among others in order to be ontologically secure? We know actors may have many types of identities, many identities. For example, a current example actually, for example, Russia might have, we can imagine Russia as protector of orthodoxy maybe, and also as a rival of NATO. Two different identity for Russia now we have. And these two identities have different results, different narratives, different behavioral results. During the Ukrainian invasion, for example, which types of identity, Russia should be in harmony? We can multiply the identities and examples, actually. Main question of my is which type of identity the actors choose. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good question. I guess, I mean, one I guess danger in seeing identity in terms of having different identities is that in doing that, we kind of, we kind of essentialize identity into, certain characteristics and say that they exist side by side. I think that's part of, to me, that's more what we talk about when we talk about role identities. And I would say that instead of perhaps talking about different identities, I would say that different attachments to different kind of ideologies or values or in different circumstances. So not that these are different identities in a sense, but it means that different attachment means perhaps different action, at different times as well. But to me, that goes together with, if we look at identity in terms of fluidity, if we look at identity in terms of something that we try to close down temporarily, so we try to close it down in one particular direction at one point in the conflict, and at a different point in the conflict, we try to close it down in a different direction. But every time we do it, we are misrecognizing, in some sense, because there is always something left outside, so there is never such a thing as a complete identity. But that doesn't mean that, that actors try to create such kind of narrative closure. So to me, I would say that, it is about attaching, ideas to different values at different times, and then in some sense acting in accordance perhaps with those different attachments. So yeah, it doesn't really answer your question, but it means that I don't perhaps see it as being different identities. I see it as being different ways of attaching to different values, and then trying to create a wholeness around a particular identity, which is a fiction, So that's how I would. So for us as scholars, is of course to study then those different, how do these attachments look at particular times? What kind of memories do they rely upon? What kind of identity structures? What kind of narratives do they rely upon? And then try to understand how that impact action to some extent, or impact the rhetorical, discursive, in some sense, construction of identity, the legitimation of a certain action compared to another. This can be lies, like we see right now in Russia. I mean, it's, so it doesn't mean that these have to be real events or real happenings. It's, they're as fictional sometimes as the, but they're also selective in some sense. I mean, that's what we talk about, chosen traumas or chosen glories. I mean, we select events perhaps in the past to anchor a particular conception of identity. I mean, Philip Adler's work, when he looks at how material symbols or buildings or, are used to kind of anchor a certain narrative of a certain identity, are very important, because but they're still constructions in some sense, So I think that's how I would answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Berfin Çakın.
Okay. Thank you very much. Actually, you partly answered this question in terms of discourse analysis. However, I also want to ask, what do you think about empirical ways of identifying ontological insecurities in individuals? I'm currently examining ontological insecurities of women activists in Turkey and Malaysia, and through semi-structured in-depth interviews, but I face many difficulties to analyze ontological insecurities because I realize their way of understanding regarding insecurities are entirely different. They generally talk about insecurities regarding freedom of speech, legal insecurities, and even domestic violence. So you also mentioned the focus should be unspeakable and unconscious. So do you think could we also evaluate this kind of insecurities as a part of ontological insecurities? And finally, what would you suggest to analyze empirical data extract from interviews? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a very good question when we go to the individual level. I mean, and of course, it's always a challenge to analyze silences, you know, however, whatever kind of method we use, especially silences in terms of interviews, you know, I mean, how do we analyze that, what is not being brought up, and how do we relate that to that it may be in some sense so painful that it can't be brought up. I mean, there is that kind of, you know, psychological dimension to it or psychoanalytical dimension to it. So I think it is very difficult. I mean, I think the people who have done, I mean, there is a lot of kind of narrative analysis that is focused on personal narratives, you know, so it's not so much interviews as it is, you know, being able to, in some sense, let the people tell the stories about themselves, you know, and about how they have perhaps gone through certain historical events or certain traumatic events and how they've been affected by it. I would especially recommend to look at Molly Andrews' work. I mean, she doesn't do ontological insecurity, but she's done a lot of extremely interesting work she's been looking at Eastern Germany before 1989 and then come back to the subject 20 years later and interview them again. And I think the way she does narrative analysis on a very personal level is able to capture some of this, because she's also interested in capturing the kind of cultural and structural changes that have gone on, you know, and the kind of longing for the past perhaps that goes on when you know. So I don't have a good answer on exactly how to do it, but the way I've seen, you know, I think doing some kind of narrative self-biographical, you know, not or what graphical analysis on that individual level can be a way to capture it. But I think it's also important to, you know, do the research around it, you know, what kind of historical event, what kind of things have been going on to be able to place people in certain positionalities, you know, where they, you know, experience things on the basis of perhaps discrimination, marginalization, and how can we understand? So how can we understand the kind of structures they live in as also being reflected in their way of thinking about themselves? I think that's as close as I get. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left. So please ask your questions very briefly, and maybe I'll take 2 questions at a time. So also to give Catarina some time to rest. First, Murat Cingöz.
Thank you very much. I study on Iran's search for ontological security, especially focusing on the axis of resistance narrative. My question is brief. I want to learn what are the differences between the concepts of self, identity, and self-identity. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Murat. Is Elif Ezgi Keleş, please?
Hello. My question was very similar to Murat's question. I'd like to learn if the identity and self is the same thing, or if not, what's the difference between them? Thank you.
Okay, I'm glad I took these 2 questions together then. Please, Catarina.
Yeah, I mean, like I think I said a little bit in my presentation, I mean, to me, they refer to separate processes in which constructions on selfhood, I mean, and in my kind of idea of selfhood, it relies on this kind of anti-foundational notion of subjectivity, you know, how that becomes attached to various identity constructions through fantasies of closed entities, through fantasies of wholeness, which kind of delimits and anchors particular identity constructions to the idea that there is such a thing as an identity, which in itself overlooks then the kind of continuous fluidity of identity. So to me, it is a matter of attachment. So if we then bring that to what does self-identity mean then, you know, so it's not just the difference between self and identity, but also what does self-identity. I mean, to me, it becomes a way of, I think, especially for us as scholars, to perhaps describe how this kind of anti-foundational notion of self also becomes closed down in the same direction as the attachment themselves, you know. So it becomes, in some sense, a temporary overlap between self-constructions and identity constructions. I don't really use self-identity, I think, so much myself, but so to me, the difference, I mean, and the most important is perhaps to me the differences between self and identity in that sense, that but also how we think of self, you know, so not thinking of self as a core autonomous being in some sense, but as something that is constantly in a process of becoming, you know, and in that process of becoming, we attach ourselves to certain ideologies, you know, to what Lacan talks about as the master signifiers or symbolic order, the big meta narratives, the nation, the religion, the culture, I mean, culture, not there, but culture, gender, you know, the kind of meta narratives that then in some sense leads to certain action. So yeah, that's how I would see the difference on the overlaps. Thank you.
Thank you. And lastly, there were 2 questions posed on the chat by people who are not in the right circumstances to, you know, read out their questions. So I will just read them to you. The first one is about, so Zizek claims that societies are being held together by fantasies, for instance, today by political ideologies. There are many Russian people protesting the war in Ukraine. Thinking of the similar identities of Ukraine and Russia, can we say similarity of identities also create insecurity? And this question was by Zeynep Şartepe from Kadir Has University. And then there is another question about Brexit. Are democratic processes which rely on majority rule, do they create ontological insecurity? What do you think? So I think we can conclude maybe with brief answers to these 2 questions, Catarina.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood the first question, but let me start with the second one. I mean, I guess there was one question asked about this before, how you relate the democratic mechanisms for majority rule with ontological insecurity of societies. I wasn't sure how was that related to Brexit. How was the question related to Brexit? I didn't get that.
As an example, like a referendum creating insecurity in some citizens, but not in others.
Right. Yeah, I mean, any political construction of majority rule always involves some degree of closure, I would say, whether on democratic or authoritarian grounds. I mean, politics in general, you know, involves some kind of closure. The question is how much space, I guess, is provided for the inclusion of competing narratives, competing ideologies, competing ideas in the national narrative, and also on who gets to define the majority will, you know, and so to speak. So it's about, you know, the hegemonic kind of providers of emotional governance, you know. So it's, and I guess if we think in terms of, you know, democratic mechanism compared to kind of more authoritarian rules, then perhaps we will think of that there is more space provided for competing narratives. There is more space provided for competing ideas about the national narrative. But it's, of course, it becomes often what we see now with kind of populist, you know, gaining ground or have gained ground. It's, you know, it becomes a competition in some sense of the national narrative. I mean, who is to define this national narrative? I mean, the inclusion, exclusion, and who is, you know, is to be counted as a citizen. And so I think there are so many, you know, the process itself may be quite similar, but it's what the process allows for that I think differ between democratic and authoritarian government. I'm not sure if that's the response to. The first question was about how, if we have similar identity narratives, like in Ukraine and Russia, that in some sense, you know, can go back to having had a shared narrative. But I'm not sure what the question was then. Was it how that can
Zeynep, if you're in the audience, maybe you would like to explain yourself. I just read the text you sent us. Okay, you know,
yeah,
I guess, yeah.
But I mean, we can talk more generally about, I mean, of course, you know, it's the construction of narratives can, of course, I mean, like I said before, it's a temporary construction, you know, in some sense. So if different, you know, ideological bodies, I mean, different state representatives rely on a very similar construction of memory, of history, then of course we can see this as kind of overlapping temporary identities that, you know, is constructed in a certain way. But that also means that, you know, they can be deconstructed, they can be, you know, they can be defined otherwise. And I guess that's what happens in a lot of conflict. I mean, then you can emphasize different languages, for instance, Ukrainian or Russian, you can emphasize different religious ideologies, or, you know, so the separation in that sense of emphasizing one identity signifier rather than another identity signifier, I think is what's quite prevalent in many conflicts, you know, as you then try to divide yourself from the oppressor or from the oppressed, or, you know, however the situation looks like. So I think we can talk about it more generally in those terms.
Okay, thank you, Catarina. I think that was, you know, a very good answer to this question. And it's already been 1 hour and 20 minutes. And even though questions are still coming, I'd like to, you know, thank you, because I know how actually draining these Zoom webinars can be. Thank you for taking the time and, you know, answering all the questions which were posed with so much patience and understanding and constructive feedback. We have definitely learned a lot and benefited a lot from having you in this forum. We were honored that you supported us in this endeavor. So as you can see, there are many students here who are very interested and following your work. And we would like to, you know, continue this series maybe with, you know, one speaker per semester to keep up this interest. And as long as we find the opportunity, we are also going to be delighted to host you in person here.
Thank you very much. I mean, thank you all for excellent questions. I thought, you know, not always easy questions to answer.
Yes,
such a short time. But
very
thank
good
you so much. I really enjoyed it.
So
thank you for inviting me and everything. It was really a pleasure on my behalf.
Thank you, Catarina. So, okay, then we're going to give maybe an applause with our different signs and signals on Zoom.
Thank you.
And I would like to also let all the participants know that, we are interested in setting up some form of a mailing list so we can keep connected with one another. So Aslı Nur, I think, is going to be getting in touch with the participants to see if you are interested in joining this mailing list, so we can keep the connection of this webinar. Anything else is there anything I need to add? Helen, would you like to add anything? Umut, Aslı Nur, did I forget something?
Well, it was all. We are trying to, as I said, we are trying to form our Turkey group for the people who are studying or intending to study ontological security. So let us come together in a mailing list, and hopefully we will continue, as Bahar Hoca said, our organizations in the near future. Catarina, it was a great pleasure to have you here today. Thank you very much. Personally, and hopefully I also think that we will have less subjects to work on, like civil wars or aggressions like Russia's against Ukraine and so on. But there are so many subjects that we will continue to attach with ontological security, as this comes from our being of a human, something like a biological need. But yeah, let's keep in touch, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I would also encourage people to come to ISPP, to the Political Psychology, International Society of Political Psychology. We have annual meeting once a year. And
I am a member of that as well. Yeah.
See more of you there. That would be great if we could have more of ontological security at the ISPP.
That's great.
Yes, definitely, definitely. Umutcan, would you like to say goodbye remarks or something like that?
Thank you. Much has been said. Actually, I would like to just thank Catarina for kindly accepting our offer. I mean, thought-provoking as always. Catarina herself and our audiences were certainly, raised very interesting questions. I mean, when I started my master's at Lund, ontological security studies was just about to, getting its stream. Now, last 2 decades has left significant remarks in international political and social order. I mean, we started with 9/11, and global war on terrorism arrived, and ecological traits, refugee crisis in Europe. Now, current atrocities unfolding in Ukraine. And in order to understand all these complex processes, I mean, ontological security literature that aim to offer original analysis to these complexities has been always diverse, productive, and very open for collaboration. And I hope to continue this in this stream with our new participants today. Again, I would like to thank everyone who joined us today, and our group, and Catarina especially. So hope to keep this stream going on in the next seminars as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you everyone, and especially to Aslı Nur and Erman again for all their assistance in this organization, and wonderful job done. Thank you, Catarina, for being here with us today, and I guess it's time to conclude this meeting, and hope to see one another in other occasions.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.